The Social Policy Initiative has labelled the World Bank's concerns about extreme poverty a sham. In particular, it points to a recent report from the bank entitled Correcting Course, in which it lays out how poverty can be eradicated. In responding to some of its recommendations, SPI's Isobel Frye points the finger back at the World Bank and questions its own seriousness and commitment towards that goal. Isobel joins me now. Good evening to you and welcome. Your opinion on the World Bank is cutting, and you lay out a series of doubts about its intentions in how it gives loans and the consequences thereof. Paint a picture for us about the way the World Bank gives loans in the format it currently does and what happens when it does so.
Thanks, Iman, and thanks very much for inviting me to discuss this, because it is something that we feel very strongly about. We know and hear the World Bank's concerns as articulated in reports such as the recent one, Correcting Course. But in their actions, we don't see any correction of their course. So, for instance, the World Bank head office in 2015 committed to universal social protection. And yet we know at a country level, the officers are still required to implement what is known as poverty targeting. And what we're saying is that poverty targeting has been proven time and time again not to work, because when you target the poorest, you prevent them from actually becoming part of the mainstream. So by doing poverty targeting, you're perpetuating the alienation and the marginalization of people who actually need to be brought back into the mainstream of the economy. And the concern that we have is that because the World Bank is a lender and a maker of loans together with the IMF and other Bretton Woods institutions, they really have the say on how countries are able to form and implement their own social policies. So when the World Bank gives loans, we know that there are conditions attached. And despite our requirements for openness and transparency in our constitution, our government is caught between a rock and a hard place, because the conditions attached to the loans are practically not open to public scrutiny. So whereas our constitution requires one thing of the state, and that is inherently universal access of all socioeconomic rights set out in the constitution towards the aim of having dignity and equality, in reality, we see time and time again the anti-poverty programs being targeted in a way that is incredibly similar to what the World Bank requires. So, Iman, for instance, if you look at the 350 Rand grant that was rolled out really well by a government at the beginning of the lockdown, the COVID lockdown, that really went to people, and there was quite a high means test, knowing that people were desperate, that people had no we have in the country. What social development did was to effectively roll out an almost universal program. Treasury then came back to social development and said that they had to drop the means test, and so basically rendered 2/3 of the recipients ineligible for the assistance, even though they had no other form of income on a reliable basis. Now, that is completely in line with what the World Bank says, which is move away from universalism and start targeting. But we also know from the research that we've done at the SPI that as soon as someone who's in receipt of a means-tested grant uses that to try and produce more, that renders them ineligible. And instead of being able to build and start developing a kind of their own livelihoods, they get sunk back into poverty. And so the means testing and the targeting as prescribed by the World Bank punishes people from trying to move out of poverty. That really, in essence, is our concern, is in a country like South Africa, where we have so many people in poverty, every kind of initiative we needs to be springboarding them out. But when we know that we've taken a recent loan from the World Bank, we know we can see the immediate impact on how Treasury turns around and changes the requirements.
All right, so how better should the World Bank be financing and selecting its projects?
I think that one of the aspects that it should be doing is to consult with people, with governments, but also the people of the countries. So instead of coming in and parachuting down the kinds of policies that they believe work, to have proper consultations with people, ask what the main priorities are, and then look at how those should be done and support the state in doing the implementation of that. We've seen in certain countries, such as Nepal, for instance, where the World Bank put in a very onerous condition to social protection, that the government and people went back to the World Bank and said, no, can we work a better way, one that enables us to reach a consensus? So transparency, participation, definitely. And secondly, looking at a longer term future. So social protection should be a long-term program or system, really, instead of a humanitarian short-term program. And most of the World Bank's loans come with conditions that turn interventions into one-off programs and don't enable people to rely and start building a strategy towards a permanent system of well-being.
Isobel, if you look at the World Bank talk about itself, it cites a number of global country partnerships on a range of different areas: water, change, reconstruction, even green projects. Given your critique, how better should countries partner with the World Bank to leverage improved outcomes and loans arrangements?
Iman, it's really tricky because the power lies with the World Bank. And countries go to the World Bank as a lender when they themselves are in desperate need. So I think that one of the ways that should be looked at is to go through international agencies such as the United Nations and also looking at regional blocks. So is it not possible for the AU to club together and come together and to set up standards that they think should be invoked when they're undertaking loans? Look at regional development finance institutions and say they're not a way that they can use their muscle and their collegiality with the World Bank to come up and set certain standards in place, such as I was saying earlier, the kinds of consultation, but also looking at much more transparent accounting. So in the article that you referred to that I wrote, I cited a number of programs that the World Bank financed where people were forcibly removed. Millions of people across the world have been forcibly removed in the name of progress, development progress, financed by the World Bank. Now, that really goes against the basic cause of a human rights framework, which again is something which the World Bank is quite ambiguous about whether or not it signs up to. So when you use the term development, it seems that you evade scrutiny on your basic standards. We believe that that kind of transparency and opening up of the consequences, intended and unintended consequences, of the programs that the World Bank finances would be the first way for the bank to really learn from the impact of what its money has done in the past.
Yeah, really interesting, thought-provoking thoughts that you and insights that you raised there, Isobel, and it would seem this would make a good subject for our next national conversation, a very important matter with far-reaching consequences. Isobel Frye is Director of the Social Policy Initiative.